Good morning. Today I am present before you with V.S. Naipaul's work, A House for Mr. Biswas. I will be talking house as a metaphor in A House for Mr. Biswas. So here we go. V.S. Naipaul is an expatriate from Trinidad whose primary business as a novelist was to project carefully the complex fate of individuals in a cross-cultural society. He has written extensively about different aspects of post-colonial society, but knowingly or unknowingly, whether he is writing a travelogue or a novel, he tends to end up dealing with the identity crisis of an individual. Naipaul's magnum opus, A House for Mr. Biswas, can rightly be called a work of art that deals with the problems of isolation, frustration, and negation of an individual. A House for Mr. Biswas tells the story of its protagonist, Mr. Biswas, from birth to death, each section dealing with different phases of Mr. Biswas's life. The novel delineates the traumas of a tainted and troubled past and the attempts to find a purpose in life, beautifully analyzing the sense of alienation and the pangs of exile experienced by the characters. The image of the house is a central unifying and integrating metaphor around which the life of Mr. Biswas revolves. Delineated in compassionate tones for Mr. Biswas, the house represents a search for emancipation from dependence. The novel paints a poignant picture of Mr. Biswas as he struggles to preserve his own identity in an alien environment and tries to forge an authentic selfhood. Besides focusing on his dark world, the novel introduces brief glimpses of ethnic and social history of the marginalized East Indian community in Trinidad. The narrative tries to maintain an equilibrium between Mr. Biswas's inner self and the disinterested outer view. The life of Mr. Biswas resembles the life of Naipaul himself, whose series of experiences of exile and alienation while living in Trinidad seem to be portrayed through the character of his protagonist, Mr. Biswas. From the very beginning, Mohan Biswas is depicted as a marginalized individual who is constantly on the move to identify his place in the limited world of Trinidad. He tries to find his own roots in the socio-cultural environment around him. In the search of his own identity, Biswas shifts from village to town and from joint family to nuclear family, but fails to find his own roots amidst socio-cultural change. Naipaul has depicted a protagonist in a society that is pandemonic and lacking in ideas and creativity. The novel is dominated by the house metaphor. Here, Hanuman House is described as follows. I quote, "An alien fortress. The concrete walls looked as thick as they were, and when the narrow doors of the Tulsi store on the ground floor were closed, the house became bulky, impregnable, and blank. The benevolent monkey god Hanuman." Unquote. Hanuman House is not just the abode of Tulsi clan. It has a certain significance in addition to being just a residence. First, it has a symbolic name. To Mr. Biswas, this house seems to be a zoo with many specimens in it. The house, for all its organization, is more of monkey business than anything else. And Hanuman was the monkey god. Hanuman House is a metaphor of traditionalism, rigidity, cultural perfection, ritual duty, hierarchy, and communal life. On a closer examination, we find that Hanuman House does not have such an attractive family organization as appears on the surface. The organization is in fact a slave society built up by Mrs. Tulsi and Seth, who need workers to maintain their empire. The author has depicted the world of Hanuman house in such a way that the house becomes the metaphor as well as symbol of stagnation, decay, and darkness. It is described as a fortress impregnable, windowless, slightly sinister. In fact, every other home at the Chase, at Greenvale, at Short Hills, and in the port of Spain also produces a similar impression. After coming to Chase, Mr. Biswas's attitude towards Hanuman House changes, whereas he has used to think that Hanuman House is not ordered. He discovers that, I quote, "The house was the world more real than the Chase and less exposed. Everything beyond its gates was foreign and unimportant." Unquote. Mr. Biswas feels that despite hostility, he is recognized as a mimic man in Hanuman House. At Chase, he feels alienated. What Naipaul seeks to convey is that a person's social identity depends on the society to which he belongs, and that the family is sustaining and stabilizing experience for marginalized individuals like Mr. At Greenvale, Mr. Biswas and his family are given a room in the barracks, but here they feel quite uncomfortable. So Mr. Biswas decides to build a house of his own. The new house which Mr. Biswas decides to build again acts as a metaphor and symbol of his personality, which presents private individuality. The construction of this house parallels at all points his own development as a person. Mr. Biswas moves into the finished rooms of his house, thinking that the house is going to bring a changed state of mind. But the intensity of alienation and displacement continues, and he fails to gain acceptance as an individual. The house, which acted as a metaphor for portraying individuality, now becomes a place of alienation for Mr. Biswas. When Mr. Biswas gives a doll's house to Savi, it symbolizes his aspiration to possess a house of his own. So here too, this doll's house can be looked up as a metaphor. It is after this house that Mr. Biswas decides to build a house at Greenvales. Unable to tolerate his dependence upon the Tulsi family and unwilling to make a surrender of his self-respect, Mr. Biswas wishes to have a house of his own. This desire of Mr. Biswas is symbolic of an individual wish to preserve his individuality. The house at Greenvales was made in the midst of a forest. The author has used it as a metaphor of alienation and isolation from society. Mr. Biswas does not allow his individuality to be swamped or vanquished, though he dies in debt, but he maintains his individuality and completely breaks the chain and shackle of the Tulsi family. The title of the novel hence becomes significant. Mr. Biswas wanted to own a house so as to be able to assert and preserve his independence. He is able to own a house at the end. His ownership and possession of his dream house shows his freedom, his victory over all odds. To conclude, it can be said that Naipaul's novel succeeds in transcending the individual self by universalizing the issue of alienation. A House for Mr. Biswas presents before us a unique experience of a person who craves for a house of his own and ultimately gets it. Very dexterously and adeptly, the novelist has employed house as a metaphor in the novel, and hence he should be applauded. So here we are. The house acts as a metaphor in this particular novel. I hope this video proves to be of help to each one of you. Please do like, share and subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell icon to get the latest updates. Thank you for watching. Wishing all of you a great day ahead.